No, there was no discussion with citizens. In fact, one of the great problems of this process was the lack of discussion with citizens. I think citizens felt that they really didn't have an opportunity to be listened to. They didn't have an opportunity to ask questions of the people who were making the decisions. I think that people again were very frustrated that this process was not fulsome. I think that at the end of this process, people felt that they never had been given a full opportunity to be consulted in regard to the choices that were being made. In fact, it seemed from the very beginning to be fait accompli. And as a result, no one has had faith that the process was a due process and one that really answered the issues that our community raised.
And we know from the current Prime Minister of Canada that the National Energy Board can't be trusted to do a legitimate, rigorous review, that they torque the system to get to yes, including excluding people who are directly affected from this project from participating in the process. There is a huge disconnect when the Prime Minister of Canada says we cannot trust the National Energy Board to do a rigorous review, we cannot trust the National Energy Board report, and promises that the review would be redone for these reasons and then breaks his promise. There is a huge disconnect when the National Energy Board says that it is reviewing it in the public interest and then the record shows that it does not do so. There is a huge disconnect when a company like Kinder Morgan says one thing and does another. So we have this situation where the residents of Burnaby and the city of Burnaby are faced with broken promises, and corporations, regulatory agencies and governments that say one thing and do another. They are disingenuous and they are betraying the public and the trust the public has put into these agencies and elected officials.
The proposed pipeline route alignment will be located entirely in the new corridor. This will result in significant impact to the environment, to city infrastructure, and increase in future costs as it relates to the maintenance and/or enhancement of city infrastructure that is in close proximity or crossing the pipeline.
Throughout, they claimed this to be a twinning, when in actuality in the city of Burnaby, none of the facilities are twinned. It's a brand new route going through our city. In fact, they are going to take out some of the existing pipeline, but they're not decommissioning it. They're not going to be utilizing it right now, but they're not taking it out of the ground, which is another one of the problems, is they put these pipes in the ground with no obligation to ever remove them.
Kinder Morgan began its proposal pretending that this was a twinning of a project when it's not. When you add on top of that risk that already exists, that has never undergone environmental review because it was built before environmental review was done, and now you have a brand new pipeline route going through another part of Burnaby, you more than double the costs, you more than double the disruption and inconvenience, you more than double the risk. Because now you have two routes, both or either of them could have problems, and both and either of them disrupt the ability of Burnaby to plan its future. And the board has not examined any of this cost or risk. And it crowds out Burnaby's opportunity for its right over infrastructure decisions and quality of life considerations for the benefit of a private pipeline company that does not have to face the implications of those costs.
Right now I'm standing at Stoney Creek, the area where the pipeline will be crossing. There are many other streams where the pipeline will be crossing, such as Holmes Creek, Lost Creek, and tributary to Eagle Creek. To accommodate the pipeline, the trees located within the 10-meter wide easement, as well as the workspace, which vary in width up to 25 meters, will be removed. Even with the remediation of the workspace areas, this will significantly impact the Burnett River Conservation Area. It'll decrease its conservation value. It'll impact the buffer area, which is located between Shellmont Tank Farm and Forest Hill Meadowood neighborhood area, and will sterilize Cottonwood Mark as it relates to its intended use as a neighborhood park. Furthermore, in an event of a spill for a product such as dilbit, the impact in such a sensitive area will be devastating. There will not be enough time at all for containment. With respect to the implementation of the expansion, it'll require removal of thousands of trees at the Burnaby tank farm area and hundreds of trees at the Westridge Marine Terminal.
Going through Burnaby, they've chosen a route that's right through our conservation area. This is an area that was purchased by the city of Burnaby back from Simon Fraser University and the province because our citizens thought it was so important to protect this as green space. And in fact, by referendum, they dedicated Burnaby Mountain Conservation Area in perpetuity as being conservation and park use. So we have said over and over again through the democratic process how important this area is to preserve. These are the lungs of a place like Vancouver, is the opportunity to have an area like this of trees, wildlife, and ecological environment is part of the fabric of making our communities livable. Cottonwood Park was approved by referendum in 2014 by almost 90% of our residents. So when you impose a pipeline on those democratic values that have been espoused by our citizens through a vote, it is offensive to our entire community. You know, we had a spill in 2007 here, relatively soon after Kinder Morgan took over Trans Mountain. And it was a spill that was subsequently found by the Transportation Safety Board to be a poor reaction by Kinder Morgan to an emergency. It was something that can happen anywhere as a result of work that was being done on the road. The pipeline was accidentally hit, and there was no supervision as required under the Act from Kinder Morgan while that digging was being done. And after it occurred is that unfortunately Kinder Morgan turned the pipe off at the wrong end. They turned it off at the end where it was feeding into the tankers, not where it was coming from the tank farm. So this oil continued to spray and spill all over our Westridge neighborhood. There were millions of dollars in damages. Kinder Morgan was required to expend a lot of resources and a lot of capital. And even then, we didn't avoid the environmental damage that was caused by the oil going into our creeks and streams and eventually into Burrard Inlet. So we've experienced what was a relatively minor spill, and the impacts of that minor spill were such that it cost our residents a great deal of grief, a great deal of money, and left them with worries as to their health in the future. And the environmental damage will remain for many, many decades into the future. Well, I think all of us are very concerned about the route. In fact, it was one of the great failures of the process that they refused to consider any other routes. They essentially relied entirely upon what was in the best economic interests of Kinder Morgan, rather than looking at what would be in the community's best interest, or for that matter, what would be in the province's best interest. One should be looking at a much broader spectrum of choices than simply what the corporation tells you is the best route for them. You should be looking at a route that has the least environmental impact, that is unlikely to present more problems as far as public safety are concerned. But in this case, everything was based on where existing Kinder Morgan facilities were, and as a result, it's one of the poorest choices you could have made for a route. Taking this oil to the very end of the inlet through two sets of narrows has to be the most absurd idea I have ever heard. I think most citizens and most experts would say the last place you want to move these tankers is through the first and second narrows in Burrard Inlet. If there is an accident in that port, it will be hundreds of years before the impact is over. And again, it was no one thinking about anything other than what are Kinder Morgan's economic interests. The routing that has been established through our community has not been sanctioned by the city or by our residents. We certainly have not seen our residents step up and say this is a good route or it's one in which we feel comfortable. Kinder Morgan has said over and over again that this is a result of consultation with people in our community. Well, I can tell you right now, it's not. There is no record of any consultation in which they arrived at a solution of going through the conservation area. You know, when you look at what has occurred up to this point, it's a situation in which entirely it's been the corporate interests that have dictated not only the routing, but the choice of eventual destinations. And the fact that there has not been a true consultation, a true effort made to find the best possible route, I think is one of the ultimate failures of the National Energy Board process.
This pipeline project is going through the city of Burnaby, which is a densely populated urban area, because it's the least cost and most profitable option for Kinder Morgan. The National Energy Board did not look meaningfully at any pipeline route alternatives. The National Energy Board did not look at how could this pipeline be built and Canada could still meet its climate change commitments. What we have are alternative routes, alternative pipeline systems, alternative ways of developing our resources that are lower cost to the Canadian society, economy, and the environment, and the NEB refused to look at them. So for example, we've got a situation where not only did the NEB not look at alternative routes to pushing this pipeline through a highly densely populated area like Burnaby, and its ongoing costs and risk for decades to come, the National Energy Board deliberately relied on outdated supply projections for oil, ignored market pricing conditions of oil that are expected to continue for years into the future, ignored international global oil supply, and ignored climate change commitments in order to suggest that this project is needed. Trans Mountain's expansion is not needed. This route through Burnaby makes no sense, and yet the project's proceeding. There is no reason that this project should be pushed on to Burnaby and its residents with such force when it's not wanted, needed, and has huge environmental, economic, and social costs attached to it.
When we look at the expansion of the Kinder Morgan tank farm on Burnaby Mountain, it is entirely unacceptable. You know, in the 1950s, looking at a tank farm in a fairly remote area, even if it was on the side of the mountain, seemed like a good idea. But now that this city has built up around that tank farm, is that subsequently we've had Simon Fraser University on the mountain. We have great many single-family homes. There are multiple family residences, cooperatives, there's schools that have been built up in the area. All of them would come under threat as a result of a fire at the tank farm. But it is ridiculous to look at expanding a facility that would never be built there now. The likelihood of an event happening that would be unable to be contained to one tank would likely spread to other tanks is much, much higher than it would have been otherwise. So I think everyone in Burnaby has to be worried about if there is an accident, the inability of our firefighters, or even with the greatest assistance we can provide throughout the region, our inability to be able to put that fire out.
The Trans Mountain Expansion Project is a brand new pipeline through a highly densely populated city with 14 new larger tanks to store highly toxic diluted bitumen in it that is highly flammable, and a brand new 3-berth marine terminal capable of loading Aframax crude oil tankers. This is a brand new project. It should be examined in the context of a major project like this coming into an urban setting. If the existing Trans Mountain system was proposed today to go through Burnaby, it would never be accepted. So just because it exists does not justify the irrational logic that somehow this new project should be acceptable. Private companies are not in the business of investing in pipelines for the benefit of Canadians. Private companies are in the business of making profits for their shareholders. So any suggestion that Kinder Morgan is engaged in this activity for the benefit of Burnaby residents, the Lower Mainland residents, or the broader Canadian public is nonsense. Kinder Morgan, for example, has promoted this project, suggesting that corporate tax revenue will flow to the federal and provincial governments. Well, Kinder Morgan barely pays any corporate tax at all, and they're structured to not pay corporate tax in the future. The NEB ignored this fact, saying that Kinder Morgan's current corporate tax behavior and likely future corporate tax behavior was outside the scope of a public interest review. Frankly, that's ludicrous. Kinder Morgan knows that the National Energy Board is an industry-captured regulator and that it does the bidding of private pipeline companies. We've had 2 recent reviews conducted through the federal government that confirm the National Energy Board does not make decisions in the Canadian public interest. And so Kinder Morgan knows that the route review process is a foregone conclusion, where their preferred route will be the route that is chosen, even though it has significant costs to Burnaby and its residents. The facts clearly show that Trans Mountain's expansion is not needed, it's not wanted, and represents huge economic, social, and environmental costs. It certainly should not be forced through a densely populated urban environment such as the city of Burnaby.
And one of the biggest problems we have is that we don't have a national oil policy. We do not have a national fossil fuel strategy. There is no operating mind behind this. There is simply what do the corporations want. The city of Burnaby is the 3rd largest city in British Columbia. We are a city that highly values our position as an important center for commerce, business. We have established over many years that the high-tech industry, the movie and television industry, the environmental sciences industries, education are the key attributes that we're developing to ensure we have a vibrant economy well into the future. We also have the obligation to protect the environmental values of our city and our citizens. We also have an extended responsibility to ensure that Burrard Inlet and that our coastline are protected. So when we look at opposing a project like this, we're doing so not only because of our interests locally and as a community, but we're also saying there has never been enough discussion about what the real interests of Canada are, and we haven't had adequate representation of British Columbia's interests throughout the process. In fact, what we ended up with was an approval that was granted without ever going back and relooking at the fatal flaws that made this process unfair. And when you have the Prime Minister of Canada recognizing that his authorization is given on a process that was unfair from the very beginning, is that I think all of us have to be worried. We have to be worried about who's controlling the choices that are being made. Are we actually, as a democracy, listening to our citizens and their interests, or are we simply reacting to the interests of multinational corporations who are exploiting resources in our country? I think people in my community have come to the conclusion that it's the latter.
If Kinder Morgan's proposed pipeline route through Burnaby were to be approved by the National Energy Board, this is the approximate route it would follow. Starting from North Road, the pipeline would run through the Brunette River Conservation Area, requiring significant tree removal in the pipeline corridor and impacting road infrastructure improvement. It would carry on adjacent to and through Cottonwood Park, requiring the permanent removal of hundreds of trees and making Cottonwood Park a park no more. And behind the Habitat for Humanity housing development, requiring the removal of hundreds of trees between the homes and Lougheed Highway and creating noise and dust. Under Lougheed and Gallardy, one of many locations where traffic disruption would be significant. And along East Lake Drive to Production Way, where noise and dust will accompany construction, and where Burnaby had planned to continue to develop a multi-use path and greenway. Through the Shelmont area, where the pipeline is proposed to travel through a covenanted, treed buffer zone, requiring the removal of trees for the 10-meter wide pipeline easement. The adjacent Meadowood neighborhood is in close proximity to this route. To the tank farm, where 14 new, larger tanks would be built, requiring the permanent removal of thousands of trees and significantly increasing fire and spill risks. Under the Burnaby Mountain Conservation Area. And to the West Ridge Terminal, where hundreds of trees would be removed and 3 new loading berths would be built, along with onshore infrastructure on new shoreline infill, all to transport toxic, unrefined diluted bitumen oil to non-Canadian markets through sensitive Burrard Inlet habitat and through perilous narrows. This route has not yet been approved. The City of Burnaby is determined to continue to work with you to ensure it never will be.